There were 17 years of small surrenders. That's what I keep coming back to whenever I try to explain it to anyone. Not the betrayal itself, but the thousand little moments before it that I chose to look away from. The dinners I ate alone because she was too tired. The weekends she spent with her phone tilted just slightly away from me. The way she stopped laughing at my jokes somewhere around year 11, and I told myself that's just what happens. Marriages settle. People get comfortable. I believe that right up until I didn't. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I was 44 years old. I worked in commercial HVAC systems, and I had spent the better part of 2 decades building something I was proud of. A house in Knoxville with a good yard. 2 kids, a son in his second year at University of Tennessee, and a daughter finishing her senior year of high school. A marriage I thought was solid the way old furniture is solid. Heavy, worn in, dependable. Her name was Lorraine. We met in our mid-20s at a friend's cookout in Nashville. She laughed at something I said, and I thought, that's it. That's the one. I wasn't wrong about how she made me feel. I was just wrong about what that feeling meant long term. The first crack I remember, the real one, not the little daily frictions, happened about 3 years before everything ended. I came home from a week-long job in Chattanooga, and the house smelled different. Not dirty, just different, like someone else's air had settled into the rooms. I mentioned it to her, and she looked at me like I'd said something mildly embarrassing. "You've been gone a week," she said. "The house just aired out." I let it go. I was good at letting things go. My job took me away often. Not constantly, but enough. Maybe 8 or 9 days a month on bigger commercial contracts. I'd drive to job sites in eastern Tennessee, sometimes cross into Virginia or North Carolina for the bigger builds. Lorraine worked from home, managing accounts for a regional marketing firm. She had flexibility. I didn't. I used to think that was a good thing. About 2.5 years before I left, I started noticing a truck, a dark green Dodge Ram, newer model. It would be parked down the block when I came home from long trips. Not in front of our house, 2 or 3 houses down. Enough to be unremarkable if you weren't looking. I was looking, eventually. I never saw who drove it. I told myself I was being paranoid. Lorraine had never given me a concrete reason for suspicion. Nothing I could point to and say there. She was distant, yes. She had stopped initiating conversation the way she used to. She answered my questions, but stopped asking me any of her own. But marriages drift. People get preoccupied. I had read enough advice columns over the years to know that distance doesn't automatically mean betrayal. Sometimes it just means 2 people have stopped trying at the same speed. So I kept quiet, and I worked. And I came home to a house that increasingly felt like a place I rented rather than a place I lived. The moment I knew, the real knowing, not the suspicion, came on a Tuesday in March. I had a job in Bristol that got pushed back 2 days because a parts supplier failed to deliver. I came home without calling ahead, not intentionally. I just forgot. I was tired and annoyed about the delay, and I drove home on autopilot thinking about rescheduling the crew. The green truck was in the driveway, not down the street. In my driveway, parked behind Lorraine's Kia like it belonged there. I sat in my truck at the end of the street for a while. I don't know exactly how long. It was a kind of stillness you fall into when your body knows something. Your mind is still refusing to process. The afternoon light was doing that thing it does in March in Tennessee where it's golden and cold at the same time, and I remember watching it hit the chrome on that Dodge and thinking, this is the moment. Everything before this was a marriage. Everything after this is something else. I didn't go inside. I pulled away, drove to a gas station 2 miles away, got a coffee I didn't drink, and sat in the parking lot until it got dark. When I drove back, the truck was gone. The house looked exactly the same. Lights on in the kitchen. Television glow in the living room. Ordinary. I walked inside. She was making pasta. She said, "You're home early." I said, "Job got pushed." She nodded and turned back to the stove. That was it. That was all of it. I didn't confront her that night, or the next night, or the week after that. I've had to explain this to people, and they always look at me a certain way, like I must have been a coward or a fool. What I was methodical. Something had locked into place in my chest, and it wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't confused about my marriage. I wasn't second-guessing myself or wondering if the distance was my fault or something we could fix with a weekend away. I knew. And knowing is actually very calming once the shock of it passes. I spent the next 6 weeks educating myself. I opened a new bank account at a credit union across town, one she had no knowledge of. I started redirecting a portion of my paycheck, not to hide assets, but to establish financial footing. I met with a family law attorney named Patricia. Wait, I'm not supposed to say Patricia. I met with an attorney, a woman who had handled dozens of cases like mine. She walked me through the process with a practicality that I found genuinely comforting. Tennessee is a fault state, she explained. That mattered. I photographed the truck's license plate on my next return home. It took 2 more trips before I caught it parked down the street again. I ran the plate through a contact I had at a towing company. Not legal advice, just a favor. And got a name. Somebody's ex-husband of somebody my wife had apparently known for a while. He worked in insurance. Lived in a condo in Maryville, about 40 minutes away. I filed the information away. I didn't hire a PI. I didn't need more confirmation. I already knew. What I needed was a plan, and a plan takes time. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter because that's all she is in this story, finished her high school soccer season in April. I went to every home game. I stood on the sidelines and cheered and brought her a terrible gas station coffee the way she liked it. Extra sugar, splash of creamer. I want to be clear about that. I was present for my kids through all of it. Whatever was collapsing between me and Lorraine, that was between me and Lorraine. My son called me every Sunday from campus. I talked to him about his coursework, about the girl he was cautiously starting to like, about a professor who was giving him trouble in an economics seminar. Normal things. Father-son things. I was not absent for any of it. That part was important to me. Still is. By early June, I had most of the pieces in place. I'd rented a small apartment in Asheville, North Carolina, close enough to several of my regular job sites, far enough from Knoxville that it was a genuine fresh start. I had a new phone plan. I'd quietly moved my most important personal documents, birth certificate, social security card, the savings bonds my grandmother left me, to a lockbox at the credit union. I had spoken to the attorney twice more. Papers were being prepared. I told my son first, drove up to Knoxville one Sunday and took him to lunch at a barbecue place he liked near campus. I told him his mother and I were separating. I told him it was not his fault, and it was not about anything he had done. I told him I loved him, and that nothing between us was going to change. He didn't say much. He's like me in that way. He processes before he speaks. We sat there for a while after the food was gone, and then he said, "Are you okay, Dad?" And I said, "I will be." That was the truest thing I knew how to say. I told my daughter 2 days later. She cried. I held her while she cried, and I didn't say anything useful because there wasn't anything useful to say. She asked if it was her mom's fault. I told her marriages are complicated and that she didn't need to assign blame. She looked at me, she has her mother's eyes, this sharp evaluating look, and said, "That means yes." I didn't confirm it. I also didn't deny it. I gave myself a leaving date, a Sunday morning in late June. I had been planning it for so long that the morning itself felt almost anticlimactic. I got up before sunrise. Lorraine was asleep. I'd packed my essentials into the truck over the course of the previous week, a bag or a box at a time, tucking things into the cab under a tarp so it looked like job equipment. Tools. Work gear. Nothing to notice. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Just stood there. Not for drama. I don't think I'm a dramatic person, but because I needed to look at it one more time. The kitchen where I'd made pancakes on Saturday mornings for 15 years. The table where my kids did homework. The windowsill where Lorraine kept her little collection of ceramic birds because she went through a phase of buying them at antique stores and then just kept them there forever. The way people keep things they've stopped seeing. I put my house key on the kitchen counter. I put the divorce papers next to the key. The attorney had filed them already, but I left a copy. It felt like the right thing to do. Not cruel, just honest. I walked out to my truck, started it, backed out of the driveway. I didn't look back at the house. That was intentional. I'd heard people say you're supposed to look back, and I decided I didn't want that image. I wanted to keep looking at where I was going. I was in North Carolina before noon. Lorraine called at 11:47 a.m. I know the time because I looked at the clock on my dash when the phone lit up. I let it go to voicemail. She called again 7 minutes later. Then a third time. Then a long gap. Then a text that I read at a rest stop in the mountains. "Where are you? What is going on?" I didn't respond until that evening. I sent a text that said, "The attorney will be in touch. The kids know. Take care of yourself." She called twice more after that. I didn't answer. There was nothing more to say that the paperwork didn't already cover. The apartment in Asheville was small, and smelled like fresh paint and pine. I had a bed, a secondhand couch I'd bought the week before, a coffee maker, and a view of the mountains that I stood in front of for a long time that first evening. I don't know what I was expecting to feel. Relief, maybe. I did feel relief. Also a kind of ache that I don't have a clean word for. Not regret. Not grief exactly, but something like the feeling after you set down a very heavy thing you've been carrying for so long you forgot you were carrying it. The divorce was finalized 9 months later. Lorraine's attorney pushed back on the asset division, the house specifically, but the evidence the attorney had compiled, combined with the fault filing, resulted in a settlement that was fair without being vindictive. I wasn't trying to destroy her. I just needed it to be done. She kept the house. I got a fair share of the equity. We divided the savings without much drama. Our kids are adults, or nearly so, and they made their own choices about who to stay close to and when. I didn't campaign for their loyalty. That felt wrong to me. Whatever they feel about their mother is their business. My son visited me in Asheville in October, about 4 months after I left. We hiked part of a trail near the parkway and talked more honestly than we ever had. He told me he'd had a feeling something was wrong for years. He said he used to come home from school and feel the tension in the house like weather. He learned to disappear into his room with headphones. I apologized to him for that and meant it. He said he didn't need an apology. I gave him one anyway. My daughter took longer. She was angry at first. Not at me specifically, I don't think, but at the situation, at the disruption. She called me every few days for the first month, and I could hear the anger in her voice shifting, slowly, into something softer. By Christmas, she drove up to Asheville with a friend and spent 3 days with me. We made terrible attempts at Christmas cookies and watched movies, and she told me about a boy she was cautiously starting to like. I thought about how I'd said something similar about her mother to my own father once, a long time ago. Things come around in funny ways. Lorraine and I did not speak for almost a year. The first time we talked was a phone call in the spring about a tax document. Practical, brief, civil. She sounded tired. I felt nothing particularly charged when I heard her voice. That was strange after everything. You spend 17 years building a life with someone, and then one day their voice is just a voice. About 8 months after the divorce was finalized, so about a year and a half after I left, my daughter called to tell me that her mother had been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. She was crying when she told me, not because of the diagnosis, she said, but because she didn't know how to feel about telling me. I told her she did the right thing, telling me. I meant it. I sat with that information for a few days. I want to be honest here, because I think people expect a certain reaction, and I don't want to perform something I didn't feel. I didn't feel vindicated, I didn't feel glad, I also didn't feel, if I'm being fully truthful, the sweeping compassion that makes for a satisfying story. What I felt was complicated. Something like sorrow for a person I had once loved, mixed with a clear recognition that what happened between us was still what it was, regardless of what was happening to her now. I called her. We talked for about 40 minutes. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, which is a strange thing to say about two people who were married for 17 years. She didn't apologize directly. She's not built that way. But she said she made choices she regretted. I told her I hoped her treatment went well. I offered to help with costs if the insurance situation became difficult. She said she'd let me know. She did let me know, eventually. There was a gap between her coverage and a specific drug protocol her oncologist wanted. I wired money for 2 months of that gap. Not for her sake, not entirely, for my daughter, for my son, for the version of myself I wanted to be when I looked back on this. Not the man who collapsed into bitterness, not the man who gloated. The man who, when it was over, could still act from somewhere that felt like his own character. People have opinions about that, I know. Some people think I was foolish. Some people say I should have let her deal with it herself. Maybe they're right. I don't spend a lot of time defending it. I just know that when my daughter found out what I'd done, she drove up to Asheville on a random Thursday, no warning, and hugged me in the parking lot of my apartment building for a long time without saying anything. That was enough. Lorraine's cancer went into remission by the following autumn. I found out through my daughter. Same as everything else now. I said I was glad to hear it. I meant that too. I've been in Asheville for almost 2 years now. I got a promotion that expanded my territory into western North Carolina and upstate South Carolina. I bought a better couch. I started hiking regularly. Not because it's the thing people do when they're starting over, but because the mountains here genuinely do something for me that I didn't expect. There's a particular trail about 40 minutes outside the city where you break through the tree line and suddenly you can see for miles. And every time I get there, I have the same thought. I should have done this sooner. Not the hiking specifically. All of it. I'm not dating. Not yet. That doesn't feel urgent. What feels urgent right now is just the daily fact of a life that belongs to me. Coffee in the morning while it's still dark. Work that I'm good at. A son who calls me on Sundays. A daughter who shows up unannounced and reorganizes my kitchen when she thinks I'm not watching. Someone asked me recently if I was bitter. We were on that trail. A friend from a HVAC contractors group I joined, and he asked it genuinely, not to be provocative. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I said, no, not anymore. I said, bitterness is just love that stayed past its expiration date, and I'm very much done with expired things. He laughed. We kept walking. The mountains looked the same as they always do. Patient, indifferent, enormous, and I thought, not for the first time, that there is something genuinely useful about being small in a large landscape. You stop thinking your particular heartbreak is the most important thing in the world. It happened. It shaped you. You carry it like scar tissue, present, but not in charge. I left the keys on the counter. I drove toward the mountains. That was the beginning of the only life that was ever really mine. I've thought a lot about what I would tell someone who's standing where I was standing 3 years ago. In their own kitchen, watching the person they built a life with move through the room like a stranger, and telling themselves it's probably nothing. Here's what I know now. The moment you start making excuses for someone else's behavior is the moment you begin betraying yourself. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It happens the way I described those 17 years, like paper cuts. One small surrender at a time. And the danger isn't the cutting. It's the fact that you adapt. You learn to function around the wound. You get so good at it that you forget the wound is there at all. What I did. The planning, the quiet, the methodical way I put one foot in front of the other before I ever walked out. People call that cold. I've heard it. Some people think I should have confronted Lorraine the night I saw that truck in my driveway. Screamed. Demanded. Made it loud. Maybe that's what they would have done. But here's what I've learned about myself. Rage is just another way of staying attached. Staying attached to someone who has already left you, not physically, but in every way that counts, is a kind of self-inflicted punishment I wasn't willing to keep accepting. The intelligence wasn't in the planning, exactly. It was in the decision to see clearly, to stop negotiating with a version of my marriage that hadn't existed for years. That's harder than it sounds. The human mind is extraordinarily good at protecting its own investments. You put 17 years into something and your brain will work overtime to convince you it's still worth saving. Seen past that took more effort than any of the logistics. And then there's this. What I did for Lorraine during her illness. I've had people tell me I was a fool for it. I understand that reaction. But what I've come to understand is that the way you treat someone in their worst moment says nothing about them and everything about you. I wasn't helping her because she deserved it. I was doing it because my daughter deserved to have a father who didn't let bitterness make his decisions. Because my son deserved to see that a man can be wronged and still choose his own character over his own anger. That's the only inheritance I have to leave them that actually matters. Cause and consequence are real, not in some mystical sense, just in the plain, observable way that how you act shapes who you become. Lorraine made choices. Those choices had weight. They landed. And I made choices too, in how I left, in how I handled the aftermath, in how I showed up for my kids through all of it. Those choices have weight as well. I have to live inside the person those choices built. I want to be able to stand that person. I left the keys on the counter. I drove toward the mountains. And I became, slowly and with considerable effort, someone I actually recognize when I look in the mirror. That's the whole story. And it's enough.